Just a quick note, this video is based on a book called The End of the European Era. Many of my ideas have been adapted from that book for a high school audience. You should read that book if you really want an in-depth look at the history following World War I. World War I ended, but within 20 years or so, the whole world was at war again. Obviously, something went wrong between the two wars, and today we're going to talk about some of those causes. It's important to understand, however, that no one thing caused the collapse of the peace. There were many factors, and to blame it all on one thing is an oversimplification of history. One major problem was that every country wanted something slightly different after World War I. Many in Britain, for instance, were interested in maintaining their balance of power in Europe. They wanted to make sure that no one country became too powerful. France, on the other hand, was more concerned mainly with dissing and taking as much as possible away from Germany, their mortal enemy. They wanted to make sure that Germany would never again be able to challenge them in the way they had during World War I. There was also a third group of so-called new diplomats from countries like Serbia, Poland, Czechoslovakia that were created after World War I ended. They wanted to see and use self-determination as the primary method of defining nation-states in this new world. If we take a step back and really think about primary causes, we might make a general statement that the world was going through a debate. The debate was, how should we define a state? Should it be by nationality? Should it be based on history? Should it be based on some common language? Should it be decided by Europeans? Or should the native people themselves be allowed to decide these questions? These were all legitimate questions that were being asked by different countries at this time. And many of these countries were asking this question for the first time. The dominant structure up to this point had been monarchy or some form of military dictatorship. People didn't have a choice. All of a sudden, people were allowed to ask the question formerly reserved only for the elite. And to this end, I think we should talk about the term self-determination. In its simplest definition, it's that people in a certain area ought to be able to determine who their leaders are and the boundaries of their country through some sort of democratic vote. In this scenario, the Polish, for example, might say that the area determined as Poland ought to be run by Polish people and that they get to elect a Polish leader for their parliament to help them run their country. This is self-determination. The uncontested leader of this movement, the Big Mama, if you will, was the American President Woodrow Wilson. In his envisioning of the world, he saw these new supranational organizations that would help aid in this new work of self-determination. Notice, however, I said supranatural, not supernational. We're not talking about superheroes, but about supra, which means transnational or above nationality. In his view, there ought to be organizations that help to do things like fight epidemics or, help with negotiating peace. He believed that if any country had too much power, they would wield it against other smaller countries. So he believed that these supranational organizations should be made up of members from every country and that they should be treated equally whether they're large or whether they're small. Wilson brought his ideas to Europe after World War I. In fact, he was the first sitting American president to visit Europe while he was in office. This act alone showed that the world was changing. The isolationists who believed that we ought to put America first were dying out and being replaced by idealists like Wilson. Others like, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Nixon, Bush, Clinton, Obama, all of them would speak to the world because they, in some form or another, believed in these ideals just like Wilson, that America was part of the larger world. Woodrow Wilson was greeted in Europe as a savior to usher in a new age of freedom for the entire world. He was challenged by others. Clemenceau in France acted as a kind of foil to Wilson. While Wilson had his head in the clouds thinking about supranational organizations and world peace, Clemenceau was still thinking about some, almost 2 million French people that had been killed in the war. And he needed, like so many humans, an antagonist to blame. And the villain that he chose was Germany. And he wanted to punish them and punish them hard. Throughout the entire peace process, Wilson had to give concessions to Clemenceau and others in order to get the right to do the things that he wanted to do. In order to understand the simmering problems around the world following the Great War, World War I, you have to look at all of the treaties. So let's start with the good old Ottoman Empire. If you've ever looked at a New York State Regents exam, you know they often ask, what caused the fall of the Ottoman Empire? And the answer is, you guessed it, World War I. And as such, the question was being asked in many different places around the world, how should the world be divided since many of these great powers like the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, they had all fallen? Should we create new great powers? Should we let them decide for themselves? All of these were important questions that were being asked after the war. In the case of the Ottomans, their treaty was different from almost every other treaty in World War I. While other areas were given the right of self-determination to decide their fate, the former Ottoman Empire was treated like a colony. Europeans acted like a father figure because often for racist reasons related to things like, the white man's burden, they didn't believe the former Ottomans could rule themselves. This treaty would later become associated with anti-colonial feelings because of how angry the Turkish people who were part of the Ottoman Empire felt as a result of this treaty. In fact, it might be good to stop here for a moment and mention that treaties like this made Western countries like the United States look like hypocrites. Woodrow Wilson, with his calls for world peace and lollipops, was in many ways still maintaining the old order in places where it fit his fancy. For example, there's a story of a small man by the name of Ho Chi Minh dressing up in his best suit to come and see Woodrow Wilson. He believes strongly in Woodrow Wilson's model of self-determination for his home country of Vietnam. Woodrow Wilson refused to meet with him. And, spoiler alert, Ho Chi Minh became the leader of the anti-colonial movement in Vietnam and defeated both France and the United States in a decades-long war where 55,000 and numerous hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese were killed. And it cost America much of its prestige around the world. On the other side of this hypocrisy, however, was Soviet Russia. Whenever they saw the United States acting like a hypocrite, they would call it out and say things like they were truly on the side of the working class. They argued that all America really cared about was they cared about themselves, about money, and about power. They didn't care about all these other little countries. They, on the other hand, fought for the factory workers and the liberated peasant. And although, Lenin and Stalin had their own problems with lack of free speech, censorship, and forced famine, it was sometimes hard to argue against them when America was often on the side of the colonizer. This tension between America and the Soviet Union would span the century and would give rise later to a Cold War as a battle of the minds or a battle of propaganda. On the one hand, America would define itself as the protector of democracy and free and fair elections, while Soviet Russia would pride itself as the fighter of colonialism and standing with the working and oppressed classes. Both sides, showed hypocrisy in this matter, but it's important to understand the optics of this situation if you want to understand the 20th century. But back to the moment at hand, one of the main people groups in the former Ottoman Empire, as I mentioned, was the Turkish people. In the treaty, Turkey had to give up some of their land and their capital, the beautiful Constantinople. It was internationalized and put under the control of Greeks and Italians. In addition, large areas in Asia Minor were given as colonial spheres of influence to Italy and France. This greatly angered some of the Turkish people who felt a slight to their prestige and honor as a result of this treaty. Some wanted to fight, and they found a leader in a man named Kemal Pasha. He formed a counter-government in the city of Ankara and fought so that the Turkish people would not have to sign this treaty that they viewed as unfair. The resistance greatly angered the Greeks, who believed they should continue to control Constantinople, and backed by some European powers, they sent in troops to defeat Kemal Pasha. With the aid from Bolshevik Russia, Kemal amazingly defeated the Greeks with military brilliance. In addition, the Europeans were not united in their love of Greek rule in Constantinople, and were fighting amongst themselves about the future of this city. As a result, the Turkish people won back much of the land and control of Constantinople, and their new leader, who now took a new name, Kemal Ataturk. He led a number of important reforms, including the end of the Sultan system in favor of a more modern leadership. And to signify this new modernity in Turkey, Ataturk stopped wearing the traditional fez and started wearing Western clothes to show that Turkey could compete and contend with other modern nations. The thing that you need to know about Ataturk is that he was the leader of modern Turkey and that he tried to bring new Western ideas into the country. Another area we're going to need to talk about is Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was still in many ways a hotbed of nationalistic rivalries. New treaties and new countries were being formed following World War I, and they dug deeply into the existing economic structure in Europe. It changed a lot of things. Prior to the war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had kept relative unity and peace amongst all these different people groups for their competing power. Now, however, there was no one to hold them at bay. Certain countries, if they had helped the victorious allies, were rewarded with more land. But those that had sided with Germany had to pay a political price for being on the losing side of the battle. The Bulgarians, for instance, even though their losses were only minor, were given a cap on their military. They could only have 20,000 people in their army. This led to anger and a desire for revenge among Bulgarian military officers against other countries like Yugoslavia, which was basically an enlarged Serbia, that had actually gained land following World War I as a result of siding with the Allies. Eventually, after a series of political coups and overthrows, Bulgaria ended up as a dictatorship with a desire for revenge. In contrast, friends of the Allies, like Serbia, Poland, actually gained access to self-determination and were given preference in the peace talks following World War I. This treatment, which many European countries in Eastern Europe viewed as unfair, led to a deepening of hatreds amongst many people in this area of Eastern Europe. As a result of this unrest, many countries in Eastern Europe turned away from democracy and dictatorship within, 5 to 10 years after World War I. In Austria, for example, there was a deep divide between the rural population and urban Vienna, which was their capital. The population in Austria was also unevenly distributed, with 1/3 of the entire population living in the densely populated area of Vienna. This led to a belief amongst rural peasants that the city folk didn't understand their way of life. In addition, many in the city of Vienna were socialists and liberal, while the countryside was largely Catholic and conservative. Some in Austria went so far as to believe life would be better if they could be reunited with Germany, since many Austrians speak German. This desire for reunification was known as Anschluss. Finally, probably the most talked about treaty following World War I was decided at the Paris Peace Conference, and it was known as the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty was the most talked about because it dealt with the main aggressor of World War I, which was Germany. And this treaty treated Germany very harshly. Germans lost the land known as the Alsace-Lorraine to France, and they had to give up areas with Polish populations to Poland. They lost their colonies and were limited to 100,000 troops with no aircrafts, tanks, or navy. In fact, the British confiscated any ships the Germans had not destroyed during the war. The area in Germany, also known as the Rhineland, was supposed to be occupied by Allied forces and remain permanently demilitarized. One of the most famous articles of the treaty was Article 231, which stated that the Germans have to accept full responsibility and pay reparations for the war. The initial reparations was going to cost $5 billion to be paid by 1921. At the end of World War I, the German government was so embarrassed that many members had to resign in disgrace. But this left the government in the hands of civil servants who still had kept their old rights from the days of the empire. Many of them were conservative and believed in restoring the monarchy. Because they were in control, they were also able to choose who would control the new German army, which kept the power in the hands of the industrialists and the landowners. Ruling Germany after the war was also difficult because there was no political party that held a majority. While the Democratic Socialists were the largest party, they did not hold anywhere near 50%. And the German Constitution held that in an emergency, the president could rule by decree without parliament. The Versailles Treaty was met with anger and signed by only a minority in Germany, and an acceptance of the peace treaty led to a strengthening of the monarchical right and the radical left. The right wanted to get back that honor that they felt that this treaty was taking away, and the left, on the other hand, wanted full-on Bolshevik revolution. This was not necessarily a good place for Germany to be in. To help deal with all of these new problems, our idealist, Woodrow Wilson, called for an end to this idea of blind nationalism and for a new idea called transnationalism. Transnationalism is when you think beyond the borders of your own country and do what's good for the entire world. Some of the things that tried to help this along he said we should put an end to congresses like the Congress of Vienna that was Eurocentric. Instead, he wanted to see that all parts of the world were represented at the table of world affairs. In this world, both small and large countries would have a voice rather than be dominated by a few countries at the top. He wanted to call this new transnational movement the League of Nations. That's a very important term you're going to need to know, the League of Nations. Every nation would be represented at the League of Nations, and they would fight for peace and prosperity around the globe. In fact, toward the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson had made a persuasive argument that they were fighting for this new world where boundaries should be drawn by self-determination and there would be freedom of the seas where all countries could travel along the oceans freely and that economic restrictions would be erased. Nations should be bound together in cooperation rather than fighting for these petty nationalisms that had led to World War I. Free elections would lead to states that are represented by the people instead of by these small authoritarian regimes, and importantly, he called for an end to backbenching, where secret treaties would be created in smoke-filled rooms without transparency. He put all of these ideas together in a package that he called the 14 Points. While he did have to give up many concessions to create the new League of Nations, he believed that the League would rectify any concessions later on once it got off the ground. The problem was, it never did. The League of Nations never got off the ground. The group only lasted about 20 years, and there was a series of events that limited its effectiveness even during those 20 years. This is not to say that it was a total failure. It was the first time that a supranational organization in any real form existed, and it did a number of good things, including fighting epidemics through its health organizations and helping to provide valuable statistics to countries so they could analyze the world. Wilson, however, failed at getting even his own country, the United States, to ratify the treaty and join the League of Nations. In fact, all of the major leaders at the Paris Peace Conference were soon after voted out of office. Many Americans wanted to continue down a path of isolation, and many European countries were angry at the concessions they had to make as a result of this treaty. Furthermore, both Germany and Soviet Russia were left out of the League of Nations. Because the Soviets controlled such a large part of the world, leaving them out of the League made it very difficult to get anything done. There are many ways to think about countries and how to create countries. Politicians have to consider a variety of problems when thinking about how to draw the lines for different countries and how to create leaders for those countries. No one can ever make everyone happy, and sometimes compromises or concessions have to be made. In this case, however, the continued reliance by some of the Allies in the belief of revenge and the isolation of America, there was this recipe for disaster that led to 20 years of whiplash in many parts of the world. And we're going to talk more about this whiplash in the future.